Clara Whitmore pressed her last coin against her palm so hard it left a mark in her skin. She didn't cry. She had stopped crying 6 months ago, somewhere between losing her teaching post and sleeping on a church bench in the cold. She looked at the notice pinned to the post office wall one more time. Wanted a wife. Mountain ranch. Hard life. Honest man. Her hands weren't shaking when she reached up and pulled it down. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Clara Whitmore arrived in Silver Creek, Montana territory, nobody paid her much attention. That was how she preferred it. She stepped off the mail coach with a worn leather suitcase, a pair of boots that had seen better days, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs only to people who have learned that drawing attention to themselves costs more than silence ever will. Silver Creek was the kind of town that looked friendly enough from a distance. Wide main street, a general store with a freshly painted sign, a schoolhouse with yellow curtains in the windows, a church with white steps. But Clara had lived long enough in small towns to know that the pretty parts were always the front facing the road. The parts people didn't want strangers to see were tucked around the back. She found the boarding house without asking anyone for directions. She didn't want to give anyone a reason to look at her too closely. Not yet. The woman who ran the boarding house was named Mrs. Haverford. She was a short woman with sharp eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently drawn into a shape somewhere between a smile and a question. "Room's $2 a week," Mrs. Haverford said, looking Clara up and down in a way that wasn't particularly subtle. "Paid in advance." "I understand," Clara said. She set $2 on the counter without flinching, even though it was most of what she had left. "You got family here?" Mrs. Haverford asked. "No, ma'am." "Husband?" "No." "Work lined up?" Clara met the woman's eyes evenly. "I'm looking." Mrs. Haverford's expression shifted by about 2 degrees into something cooler. "Schoolteacher." "I was." Clara kept her voice flat and factual. "I'm open to other work." Mrs. Haverford handed her a key. "Breakfast is at 6. I don't allow visitors after dark, and I'll need to know your business here before the week is out." "Of course," Clara said. She carried her suitcase up the stairs herself. She had been a school teacher for 4 years in Caldwell, Kansas. She had been good at it. The children had liked her. The parents had liked her at first. Then a man named Gerald Forsythe had decided he wanted the land her late father's estate sat on. And when she refused to sell, Gerald Forsythe had begun talking. Quietly at first, then loudly, then in front of the town council. He said she had stolen money from the school fund. He said she had been seen meeting men in secret. He said things that weren't true in the patient, methodical way that men with money and patience could afford to say things that weren't true. By the time Clara had gathered enough documents to prove what he had done, she had already lost her position, her reputation, and the house. The circuit judge who might have helped her was Forsythe's brother-in-law. So she left. She had spent 2 years moving. Salina, Dodge City, Pueblo. Each place she arrived hoping things would be different. Each place she stayed long enough to realize that a woman traveling alone with no husband and no family references was going to be treated a certain way no matter how honest she was. Silver Creek was the end of the line. Not because she had chosen it specifically, because she had run out of coach fare. On her 3rd day in town, Clara went to ask about work at the Silver Creek School. The current schoolteacher was a woman named Miss Aldrich. She was perhaps 40 with neat hair and the kind of carefully maintained dignity that comes from knowing one wrong step could cost everything. She received Clara politely in the small entry room of the schoolhouse. "I'm not in a position to take on additional help," Miss Aldrich said. "The town only funds 1 teaching position." "I understand," Clara said. "I wasn't asking to replace you. I thought perhaps there might be tutoring work or—" "There isn't." Miss Aldrich paused, then lowered her voice slightly. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitmore, because I think honesty is more useful than kindness in this case. People talk in Silver Creek. They already know you arrived alone, and they've already started asking questions. If I were seen associating with someone whose background is uncertain, it would reflect on the school, on the children. Clara sat very still. I'm not saying those things, Miss Aldrich added quickly. I'm saying what others will say. I know the difference, Clara said quietly. She thanked Miss Aldrich for her time and left. She found work at the laundry on the east end of town. Mrs. Pruitt, who ran it, was a businesswoman first and a gossip second, which meant she cared more about whether Clara could work hard than about where she'd come from. The pay was 70 cents a day. It was enough to stay at the boarding house and eat one real meal. Clara worked. She kept to herself. She learned who in Silver Creek was worth a polite nod and who was better avoided. She learned about Ethan Walker the same way she'd learned most things in town, by listening. His name came up in pieces the way names did when people were trying to say something without saying it directly. A mention here. A lowered voice there. She heard it first from two women at the general store who fell quiet when she walked past, then resumed their conversation just a little too loudly. Walker Place is still sitting up there on the ridge. Can you imagine anyone wanting that life? Well, nobody's going to want him, that's certain enough. Quiet laughter. Clara kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral. She heard the name again at the boarding house when two of the other tenants were talking after supper. Saw Walker in town today, one of them said. Did he cause trouble? He never causes trouble, just looks like he's about to. More laughter. Clara set down her fork and looked at the man who had spoken. He was a young man, no more than 25, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had his own reputation destroyed. What's he done? She asked. Both men looked at her with mild surprise, as if they hadn't considered that she might have a voice. Pardon, Ethan Walker, she said. What has he actually done? Not what does he look like. What has he done? The first man shrugged. Well, nothing specific. He just minds his own business on a mountain, Clara said pleasantly. Is that right? She finished her supper in silence. She saw the notice on a Thursday morning pinned to the post office board between a notice for a lost mule and an advertisement for farm equipment. It wasn't fancy. It was written in plain, steady handwriting on a piece of brown paper. Seeking a wife. Ranch work in the Montana mountains. Hard winters and honest living. I am not an easy man, but I am a fair one. If you are hard-working and unafraid of difficulty, write to Ethan Walker Box, 12 Silver Creek Post Office, Montana Territory. Clara read it twice. She thought about Miss Aldrich and her careful dignity. She thought about the two men at supper and their easy laughter. She thought about 2 years of arriving in new places with the same quiet hope and leaving with the same quiet defeat. She thought about Gerald Forsythe, who had taken everything she built and was probably still sitting in his house in Caldwell right now, perfectly comfortable. Then she thought about the line that had stopped her. I am not an easy man, but I am a fair one. She had known plenty of easy men. Not one of them had been fair. She pulled the notice off the board. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she walked to the post office counter. I'd like to send a message, she said. To Box 12, Demt. She expected to wait several days. She had sent a brief direct note, 2 sentences introducing herself, one asking if he was willing to speak in person. The reply came the next morning. Miss Whitmore, I'll be at the Silver Creek livery stable tomorrow at noon if you want to talk. E. Walker. Not flowery. Not particularly warm, but prompt. She appreciated prompt. The livery stable was on the north end of Main Street. Clara arrived at 5 minutes to noon, which was her habit early enough to settle herself before anyone else arrived late enough not to look anxious. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice. He wasn't speaking. She heard his boots on the wooden floor of the stable, unhurried and heavy, the kind of steps that come from a man who has learned that rushing rarely improves anything. Ethan Walker was large. That was the first thing she registered, and it was simply accurate, not a judgment, but a fact. He stood several inches over 6 feet, with the particular build of a man whose size had been shaped by actual work rather than any intention. His shoulders were broad under a faded cotton shirt. His hands, when she saw them, were the hands of someone who fixed things with them. Dark hair, a few days of stubble skin weathered by Montana sun. A hat the color of old saddle leather. He looked at her without any attempt to make the look softer than it was. She looked back the same way. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, not unkind, just careful. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Thank you for writing back quickly. I don't see the point in making someone wait when you already know what you're going to say." He gestured to a pair of wooden stools near the far wall, away from the groom who was working in the back stalls. "You mind sitting, I think, better when I'm not standing in a doorway." "I don't mind at all." They sat. He set his hat on his knee. She folded her hands in her lap. "You want to ask me things," he said, "not a question." "Yes," she said. "Is that acceptable?" "That's why I came." He paused. "Go ahead." The notice said hard winters and honest living. She looked at him directly. "I can manage hard winters. I want to know what honest living means to you specifically." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. She couldn't have named what it was. "It means I say what I mean, and I expect the same back," he said. "It means if something's wrong on the ranch, you tell me instead of going around me. It means if I do something that bothers you, you say so." He paused. "It means I won't go telling other people your business, and I expect you to do the same for mine." "That's reasonable," she said. "Most people don't think so," he said. Not bitter, just stating a fact. "I know," she said. "I've noticed that about honesty." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been in Silver Creek 3 weeks." "About that, yes. People are already talking about you." "They started talking about me the day I arrived," she said calmly. "I've come to understand that's going to happen regardless of what I do." "What are they saying?" She considered him. "That I arrived alone, that I don't have family here, that my past is unclear." She kept her voice even. "The usual conclusions that follow from those facts when people don't have enough information and decide to fill in the gaps themselves." Ethan Walker looked at her for a long moment. "Is any of what they're saying true?" "The facts are true," she said. "The conclusions aren't." She paused. "I'll tell you exactly what happened, Mr. Walker, if you want to hear it. But I won't pretend the story reflects well on me in certain people's eyes, even though I didn't do anything wrong. I'd rather you know that up front than find out later and feel like I misled you." He nodded slowly. "Then tell me." So she did. She told him about Caldwell, about the school, about Gerald Forsythe and the land and the slow, systematic dismantling of everything she'd built. She told it the same way she told everything plainly, without embellishment, without begging him to believe her. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "You kept documents," he said finally. "I kept everything I could," she said. "I still have them." "You tried to take it to a judge." The judge was his brother-in-law. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "That's a particular kind of unfair," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you've been moving since." 2 years. He turned his hat over in his hands once. "I'm going to tell you what people say about me," he said. "Same reason you told me. I'd rather you hear it from me." She waited. "They say I'm dangerous," he said. "They say I ran men off my land who came looking for trouble. That's true, I did, and they were looking for trouble, and I'd do it again. They say I'm cold. That's mostly true. I don't have much use for talking. That doesn't mean anything." He paused. "They say I should have a wife, but no decent woman would have me. I don't know if that part's true or not. I've never pushed for it until now." "Why now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I'm 35 years old. I've been running that ranch alone since I was 22. I can keep doing it alone. But I'm starting to think there's a difference between choosing to be alone and just defaulting into it because it's easier than risking something." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a more honest answer than I expected," she said. "You said you wanted honest," he said. "I did." He looked at her. "You're smaller than I expected." "You're larger than I expected," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go on." "If I came to the ranch and it didn't work, if we tried this, and it became clear it wasn't the right fit, what would happen?" He looked at her steadily. "I'd make sure you had enough to start somewhere else," he said. "I wouldn't leave you worse off than you came." "Why?" "Because that would be wrong," he said simply. She nodded slowly. "I have one condition," she said. "What's that?" "I want to be useful," she said. "Not ornamental, not managed. I want to work, and I want my work to matter. If you need someone to make the house pretty and stay out of your way, I'm not the right person." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "the only way my ranch survives the next decade is if both people running it are fully working. I don't have room for ornamental." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "When do we start?" Chind. They rode out of Silver Creek the following morning before most of the town was awake. That was Clara's choice. Not because she was ashamed of anything, but because she had learned that leaving quietly saved a great deal of energy that could be better spent on actual living. Mrs. Haverford was awake, of course. She was always awake. She watched from the boarding house porch with an expression that Clara recognized the particular mixture of disapproval and curiosity that characterized people who wanted to judge you but couldn't quite decide what the judgment should be. Clara settled her bill, thanked Mrs. Haverford politely for the room, and carried her suitcase out to where Ethan was waiting with the wagon. He didn't ask her if she was sure. She appreciated that. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a brief, practical hand, and then climbed up beside her and picked up the reins. They were on the road north before the church bell rang 6. The first 2 hours of the ride were mostly quiet. Clara didn't mind quiet. She had spent enough time around people who filled silence with noise just to avoid sitting inside their own thoughts that she had come to regard comfortable quiet as something close to a luxury. Ethan Walker was quiet in a different way than she was. She was quiet because she was watching and thinking. He was quiet because he had nothing to say until he had something to say, and he seemed to have made his peace with that distinction a long time ago. After about an hour, he spoke. "You said you kept documents," he said, "from what happened in Caldwell." "Yes," she said. "Where are they?" "In my suitcase," she said. "There's a false bottom." He glanced at her briefly. "Smart. It's been necessary," she said. Another silence. "You know anything about cattle?" he asked. "Some," she said. "My father had a small farm when I was young, mostly crops, but we had livestock. I know the basics." "The basics are a good start," he said. "You can learn the rest." "What do you run?" she asked. 40 head of cattle most of the year, some horses. I've been trying to expand the herd, but it takes capital and decent weather, which I haven't had both of at the same time yet." He paused. "I do some hunting in the winter, sell the hides." "Do you have help?" "Kid named Danny comes up when I need an extra hand. He's 16. Good worker." He paused. "He's shy around women, I should warn you. He'll get over it." "I'm good with shy," Clara said. "You said you were a teacher. For 4 years. Did you like it?" She considered that. "I liked the children," she said. "I liked that moment when something clicks for them and you can see it in their face. I didn't always like the politics around it." He made a sound that might have been agreement. "You ever want to teach again?" he asked. "Maybe," she said. "Somewhere someday, when I have ground under me again." She paused. "Right now, I want to work and be somewhere I'm not constantly being looked at sideways." He didn't say anything to that, but she had the sense that he understood it in a particular way, the kind of understanding that comes not from sympathy, but from shared experience. The Walker Ranch sat on a long ridge facing south with a view of the valley below and the mountains rising behind it to the north. The main house was plain but solid timber and stone, built to last rather than to impress. A barn, a smaller outbuilding, a well, a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat wild. It was nothing like the pictures in magazines. It was nothing like a dream. It was real, which was more than Clara could say for most things she'd been offered in the last 2 years. She stood beside the wagon and looked at it for a moment. "It's not much," Ethan said from behind her. "It's enough," she said. And she meant it. He carried her suitcase inside. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and the particular order of a man who had organized his living space completely around function. There were no decorative items. There were tools, supplies, a stack of carefully kept ledger books, and a shelf with 3 books on it. She noticed the books immediately. The Old Farmer's Almanac, a Bible well worn, and a copy of Walden by Henry David Thoreau, which surprised her enough that she looked at him. He noticed her looking. "Someone left it," he said briefly. "Did you read it?" 3 times. She said nothing, but something in her estimation of Ethan Walker shifted very slightly. The first week was a study in practical negotiation. They were 2 people who had both learned to function alone, suddenly sharing the same space, the same work, the same rhythms. It created friction in small places: who woke first, who had a method for the morning fire, how to divide the tasks without stepping into each other's territory. Clara woke at 5. She found that Ethan was already awake, which she hadn't expected. "I wake early," he said, not apologetically. "Always have." "So do I," she said. "Can you cook?" "Well enough." "Can you?" "Barely." "Then we'll divide it," she said. "I'll take mornings, and you can take whatever evenings you want to try." He looked at her with an expression she was already beginning to recognize, the look of someone who had braced for a negotiation and found the other person had already solved it. "Fine," he said. The work itself was the easiest part of the adjustment. Clara had come from farm stock, even if her last several years had been spent in classrooms and boarding houses. Her hands remembered the rhythm of physical work faster than she expected. She was not strong the way Ethan was strong. That was simply physical reality. But she was capable, and she was consistent, and she didn't wait to be shown something twice. He taught her what she needed to know about the cattle without condescension, which she appreciated more than she showed. "These 3 are the ones to watch," he said on the 3rd day, stopping at the fence. "The big roan and the 2 behind her. They'll find any weakness in the fence line, and they'll teach the others to follow." "How do you keep them in?" "You walk the fence line every week," he said. "No exceptions. It's tedious, but it's necessary." "I can do that," she said. He looked at her. "I know you can," he said. And the matter-of-fact certainty in his voice, no question in it, no testing, her landed somewhere in her chest in a way she hadn't been prepared for. The problem arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a man on a gray horse. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard the horse coming up the ridge road. She turned and saw the rider well dressed by ranch standards, with the kind of deliberate presentation that said he wanted to be taken seriously. She kept her hands on the laundry and watched him ride into the yard. He stopped a few yards away and looked at her with frank surprise. "Wasn't aware Walker had a woman out here," he said. His tone was pleasant in the surface way that certain kinds of men could manage when they wanted something. "Mr. Walker is in the barn," she said. "Right." He didn't move. "You a relation?" "I'm his wife," she said. She had decided in the first few days that this was the simplest answer. She and Ethan had not had the formal ceremony yet. They were still in the arrangement period as they'd agreed, but the complication of explaining their exact arrangement to a stranger seemed unnecessarily risky. The man studied her. "His wife," he repeated. "That's what I said." Ethan came out of the barn at that moment, having heard the horse. He took in the rider in a single glance, and something in the way he moved as he walked toward them made Clara pay attention. "Marsh," Ethan said. His voice had shifted, still level, but with a flatness in it she hadn't heard before. "Walker." The man called Marsh tipped his hat with a pleasantness that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't know you had company." She's not company, Ethan said. What do you want? Marsh smiled the practiced smile of a man who had learned to use charm the way some men use tools. Just riding the line, he said, checking in on the neighbors as a man does. Been meaning to talk to you about the water situation on the Eastern Creek. There's some discussion in town about the rights. The Eastern Creek runs through my land, Ethan said. Has since before your employer bought the Caldwell tract. Clara went very still. The name was a coincidence. It had to be. Caldwell was not an unusual name, but her hands had tightened on the bedsheet she was holding, and she made herself release them finger by finger because she could not afford to react to a name. All the same, Marsh said, Mr. Holloway would like to discuss it with you, formally. He's hosting a meeting at his place next Friday. I'll consider it, Ethan said. Marsh's gaze moved to Clara again briefly. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Walker, he said. Likewise, she said steadily. He rode off down the ridge road. Ethan watched him go, then turned to look at Clara. She had put the bedsheet back on the line by then. Her hands were still. You know that name, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. Caldwell? You went still. She was quiet for a moment. It's a common name. He looked at her steadily. Clara. She hadn't expected the use of her first name. He'd been careful about that Miss Whitmore in town distance in small ways that showed he understood the line they were both walking. Hearing her first name in his voice made it harder to be evasive. The man who destroyed my reputation in Kansas, she said carefully. His name was Gerald Forsythe. He wanted my father's land because there was a water source on it, a reliable creek. She paused. He was connected to a land investment firm. Ethan said nothing. I don't know if it's the same people, she said. I genuinely don't know. But when I hear someone talking about water rights, she stopped. I notice it. He turned and looked out at the ridge road now empty. Holloway's been buying up land in this valley for 3 years, he said quietly. He came in with money and a lawyer and started making offers. Some people took them. The ones who didn't... He paused. The ones who didn't started having problems. Clara looked at him. What kind of problems? She asked. Fence lines cut, cattle spooked. He was quiet. One man's well went dry in a way that didn't make sense given the rainfall. His neighbor who had sold to Holloway suddenly had more water than before. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. I have documents in my suitcase, she said. From what happened in Caldwell. I told you I kept everything. She paused. I don't know if it's connected, but I need to look at what I have. He held her gaze for a moment. After supper, he said. We'll look at them together. It was, she thought, the most reassuring thing anyone had said to her in 2 years. Not I'll protect you, not don't worry, just we'll look at them together. She turned back to the laundry, and the evening sun was warm on her shoulders, and somewhere down in the valley, a man named Holloway was making plans she didn't yet understand. But for the first time in a long time, she was not facing the unknown alone. The documents were spread across the kitchen table by the time the candle burned down to its second hour. Clara had laid them out in order, not the order she'd packed them, which was the order of desperation, but the order of the story itself. The letters first, then the land surveys. Then the bank records she'd copied by hand because the originals had disappeared from the county clerk's office 3 days after she filed her complaint. Ethan sat across from her and read every page without speaking. She watched him read. She had learned in the past week that he was the kind of man who did one thing at a time and did it completely. He didn't skim. He didn't glance up to ask questions that could wait. He read with the same focused patience he applied to everything else, and she found it both steadying and unnerving in equal measure. When he finished the last page, he set it down carefully and was quiet for a moment. The land survey, he said finally. The one with the creek marked. Yes. That's a government survey marker. He tapped the paper. That notation in the corner. That's a federal land office marking. I know, she said. That's why they wanted it back. He looked up at her. Because if a federal land survey shows that water source as part of your father's legal claim, then Forsyth's entire purchase of the adjacent tract is built on a fraudulent boundary, she said. The water rights were included in my father's original homestead filing. He didn't just want the land, he needed what that survey proved to be on the land. Ethan was quiet. He paid someone at the county clerk's office, she said. I couldn't prove it then, but the original survey vanished inside a week of me filing the complaint, and the clerk who handled that office bought himself a new horse shortly after. You noticed that? I notice things, she said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she'd seen him do when he was thinking through something he didn't like the shape of. Tell me about Holloway, she said. He brought his gaze back down to her. What do you want to know? Everything you know. He came to the valley about 3 years ago, Ethan said. Came with lawyers and a surveying team and a story about cattle investment. Started buying claims along the eastern side of the valley. Paid fair prices at first, which made people comfortable. He paused. Then the prices he offered started dropping, and the people who didn't sell started having difficulties. The same pattern, Clara said quietly. What pattern? In Caldwell, Forsyth started with fair offers too, she said. It builds goodwill, makes the holdouts look unreasonable. She looked at him directly. Ethan, what's the water situation on your land? He met her eyes. I have 2 reliable water sources, he said. The eastern creek that Marsh mentioned, and a spring up the north slope that feeds into it. And Holloway's land is downhill from your eastern boundary. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. If someone controlled the spring on your north slope, they could affect the water flow to everything below it in the valley. She paused. Including your creek. Ethan's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but she saw it. The neighbor whose well went dry, she said. Where was his land in relation to yours? Ethan said nothing for a long moment. Between my eastern boundary and Holloway's tract, he said. Clara looked at him steadily. This isn't about cattle investment, she said. It wasn't in Caldwell either. It's about water. The candle crackled between them. That man Marsh, she said. He works for Holloway directly. He manages Holloway's operations in the valley, Ethan said, which means he's the one organizing whatever's being organized. And Holloway wants a meeting. Yes. She looked at the documents on the table. Are there other ranchers in this valley who are holding out? 3 that I know of, he said. The Patterson family on the south end, old Henry Briggs on the western slope, and a widow named Morrison who has about 60 acres near the creek bed. He paused. She's been having the most trouble. What kind of trouble? Her fences keep getting cut, he said. Lost 4 head of cattle last month. Sheriff looked into it and found nothing. Because the sheriff... I don't know whose side the sheriff is on, Ethan said carefully. But he hasn't found anything in 3 months of looking, which is either incompetence or something else. Clara looked at him. You need to talk to those 3 families before Friday's meeting. He looked at her steadily. That's what I was thinking. Not to form some kind of grand alliance, she said quickly. Just to share information. People who are fighting the same thing separately are easier to isolate than people who know they're not alone. She paused. That's what Forsyth did in Caldwell. He made sure everyone who opposed him thought they were the only one. Ethan studied her face for a moment. You've been thinking about this longer than tonight, he said. Since Marsh rode away, she admitted. Since I heard the word water rights. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and collected the documents carefully, the way he handled anything he considered valuable. Can I make copies of these? He said. The survey and the bank records. She looked at him. Why? Because I want to keep the originals safe, he said. And I want to have something to show the Pattersons and Henry Briggs without risking what you've kept for 2 years. She was quiet for a moment. She had not shown those documents to anyone. Not because she was hiding them, but because in 2 years, there had been no one she trusted enough to let them out of her sight. "Yes," she said. "You can copy them." He nodded. He didn't thank her. But the care with which he handled that stack of papers told her something that words wouldn't have. He left before dawn the next morning to ride to the Patterson place. Clara woke to find a note on the table back by midday. "Watch the eastern fence line if you have time. E." She watched the eastern fence line. She also took her time walking every inch of the northern slope, where he'd told her the spring was studying the ground with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read what other people had rearranged. She found the marks on her third pass. They were subtle, not the kind of thing you'd notice unless you were looking for them specifically. Boot prints in the soft ground near the spring more recent than any that Ethan's pattern of movement would account for. A place where some stones had been repositioned around the spring's natural outlet. Not blocked, not obviously disturbed, just slightly deliberately altered. She stood there for a long time looking at it. Then she walked back down to the house and waited for Ethan. He came back at noon as promised, and he came back with something in his expression that she'd learned to read as controlled concern. "Patterson sold," he said, before he was fully through the door. She turned from the stove. "When?" "2 weeks ago." He hung his hat. He didn't tell anyone, just signed the papers and sold. He sat down heavily in the chair. His wife was there. She couldn't look me in the eye. Did she say anything? She said they had no choice. He paused. She said the offer they got was lower than what Holloway offered initially, but after the summer they couldn't hold on. He looked at Clara. Their well went bad in June. Their oldest son was threatened on the road, coming back from town. Threatened how? 3 men on horses. Nobody he knew. Told him his family would be better off taking what was being offered. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. "That's not a land dispute," she said. "That's intimidation." "Yes," he said. "It is." "Did they report it?" "To the sheriff who hasn't found anything in 3 months." His voice was flat. "No." She looked at him. "Henry Briggs. I'm riding out this afternoon. I'm coming with you." He looked at her. "Clara, you need someone there who understands what these documents mean," she said. "You're a rancher. You understand land. I understand what land fraud looks like from the inside because I've lived through it." She held his gaze. "I'm coming with you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you ride?" "Yes." "We leave in an hour." Henry Briggs was 71 years old and built like a fence post that had survived 40 years of Montana winters, gnarled and stubborn and not going anywhere. He met them at his gate with a rifle under his arm, which he lowered when he recognized Ethan. "Walker," he said. His eyes moved to Clara with the frank, unsentimental appraisal of a man who had no patience for pretense. "This your wife I've been hearing about?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Heard you caused a stir in town bringing her up here." The old man's gaze moved back to Clara. "You got sense." "I'd like to think so," she said. "Can you talk straight without dancing around things?" "I'll try, sir." Henry Briggs made a sound that might have been approval and stepped back from the gate. "Then come in." They sat on the porch. Clara laid out the documents, the copies Ethan had made the previous evening, and walked Henry through what she'd found in Caldwell. She didn't soften it, and she didn't dramatize it. She laid it out the way she'd laid it out for Ethan, the facts in order the pattern clear. Henry listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was rare in men his age. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Land investment firm," he said. "Forsyth's people. You think it's the same group behind Holloway." "I think the method is identical," she said. "I can't prove the connection yet. But the water rights strategy is the same. The documentation tactics are the same. The use of local men as proxies to avoid direct responsibility is the same." She paused. "That's not coincidence. That's a playbook." Henry looked at Ethan. "Your woman's sharp." "I've noticed," Ethan said. "I don't mind the compliment. Clara said, "but we have a more immediate problem." She looked at Henry directly. "Someone has been at the spring on the north slope of Ethan's property. I found it this morning. Boot prints repositioned stones around the natural outlet. Nothing that damages it yet, but the kind of thing you do when you're learning a system before you interfere with it." Henry's expression hardened. "They're mapping the water flow. That's what I think," she said. "If they understand exactly where the spring feeds from and how it connects to the eastern creek, they can affect the water levels on every property downhill without touching those properties directly." She looked at both of them. "It would look like a natural dry spell." Henry was quiet for a long moment. "My well's been running lower than usual," he said finally. "Started about 2 months ago." Ethan looked at him. "You didn't mention that." "Didn't want to borrow trouble," Henry said. He set his jaw. "Figured it was the dry summer." He looked at Clara. "You think they're already at it?" "I think they're testing it," she said. "If they do this right, they can make 3 or 4 properties in this valley uninhabitable without laying a hand on any of them. And when the owners come in desperate to sell, Holloway will offer less than half of what the land is worth, and everyone will think it's because the water's gone bad." Henry picked up one of the copied documents and looked at it. "This federal survey marker," he said. "Yes." "There's a federal land office in Helena," he said. "Yes," she said. "And if what's happening here involves federal water rights on a documented homestead claim, that's not a county sheriff's problem. That's federal jurisdiction." Henry looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him. "We'd need to document what we have first," Ethan said. "Before we send anything to Helena, we need evidence that holds up." "I have a 2-year head start on that," Clara said quietly. Both men looked at her. "I know how to build a documented case," she said. "I've done it before. The difference is this time, we have more than one person's word. We have a pattern across more than one state, and—" She looked at Henry. "We have a man who's been in this valley 40 years and knows where every water line runs." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the document and said, "Tell me what you need." They rode back to the ranch as the sky behind the mountains turned the color of worn copper. Clara was quiet for the first part of the ride. Not the comfortable quiet of the week before, but the working kind, the quiet of a mind sorting through pieces, testing the weight of things. "You're worried," Ethan said. She looked over at him. "I'm thinking." "About Henry. About the meeting on Friday," she said. "Holloway wants to talk to you, which means he knows you're not selling. And if he knows what's on your north slope, he won't make his move in public," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "But he might use the meeting to read you, to see what you know." "Then I need to know enough to be worth reading. Or you need to know enough to make him think you know less than you do." She paused. "Which is a different strategy." He looked at her. "The most dangerous thing you can do to a man like Holloway," she said quietly, "is let him believe he has more time than he does. If he thinks you're uninformed and slow to move, he'll keep running the same play. And while he does, we build the case." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And if he's further along than we think," he said, "if the spring is already being interfered with in ways you didn't see this morning, then we move faster," she said simply. He looked at her steadily. "You're not afraid of him?" "I'm afraid of him," she said. "I'm just not going to let that be the thing that decides what I do." Something shifted in his expression. It was brief the way things were brief with him, not because he was hiding them, but because he'd learned that certain feelings were safest kept short. "The widow Morrison," he said. "I need to get out to her place." "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. "We should go together." He nodded. "I'll make an early start," she said. They rode the last half-mile in silence, but it was the good kind again. The widow Morrison's name was Ruth, and she was 44 years old, and she met them at her door with the controlled, carefully maintained composure of a woman who had been holding herself together for a long time and wasn't about to stop now. Her property sat directly adjacent to the eastern creek bed. Her fences, as Ethan had said, had been cut 3 times in the past 2 months. She'd fixed them herself with wire and patience, and fixed them again when they were cut again. She had not sold. She had not filed another complaint with the sheriff after the first one went nowhere. She had simply fixed her fences and kept her cattle, and kept her mouth shut, which was the strategy of someone who had run out of other options. When Clara finished laying out what she and Ethan had found, and what Henry Briggs had confirmed, Ruth Morrison sat very still. "You think they'll come back for the fences," she said. "I think they'll escalate," Clara said honestly. "I think the fence cutting was a first step, and when it didn't make you sell, they'll move to something else." Ruth looked at her. "The water?" "Yes." "My cattle need that creek," Ruth said quietly. "If the creek goes low or goes bad, I can't hold 60 acres of grazing land." She paused. "That's what they're counting on." "Yes," Clara said again. Ruth looked at Ethan. "What are you going to do about it?" Ethan said, "We're going to Helena, but first we need to document everything. The fence cuts the dates, the timing relative to Holloway's activities, every piece of evidence we can gather." "I've kept records," Ruth said. She got up, went to a drawer, and came back with a small notebook. "Every date, every fence post, every head of cattle I've lost." She set it on the table. Clara looked at it, then at Ruth. "You've been doing this alone?" she said. "Yes," Ruth said simply. "Not anymore," Clara said. Ruth Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then something behind her eyes shifted, not breaking, but releasing the way a fist releases when the danger is finally named out loud instead of just felt. "I'll get us some coffee," she said. "This is going to take a while." They were there for 3 hours. By the time they rode back toward the Walker Ranch, Clara had Ruth's notebook in her saddlebag, a list of every incident Henry Briggs could recall dating back 2 years, and a clearer picture of the valley than she'd had when they arrived. "The meeting Friday," she said to Ethan as they came up the ridge road. "Yes." "You should go." He looked at her. "Alone," he said. "Yes." She kept her voice steady. "Not because I'm afraid to go with you. Because if Holloway sees you come in with your wife, the woman who arrived from nowhere, and who nobody in town is certain about, he's going to ask questions about me. And the last thing we want right now is for him to start looking into my past." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "If there's any connection between him and Forsyth," she said, "and I think there is, then the moment he hears my name, he'll know what I have. And he'll know it's dangerous." She looked at Ethan directly. "We cannot let him know what we have until we're ready to use it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't like you being out of sight when that man is around," he said. It was the most personal thing he had said to her since the first day in the livery stable. She felt it land somewhere careful. "I know," she said quietly. "I'll stay at the ranch. I won't go to town, I won't talk to anyone about what we're doing, and I'll keep working on the documents." She paused. "You go to that meeting and you listen more than you talk. Let him think you're a stubborn but manageable man who just needs the right offer. Don't show him what you know." "You're asking me to pretend." "I'm asking you to be patient," she said, "which I know is harder." He was quiet. "Can you do it?" she asked. He looked at her. "Can I sit across from a man who's been cutting Ruth Morrison's fences and stealing Patterson's water and threatening a 16-year-old on a road and not say what I actually think?" "Yes," she said, "because saying what you actually think right now gives him the advantage. And we are not going to give that man any more advantages than he already has." A long moment passed. "Fine," he said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I might say exactly what I think." "I'll take that risk," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely, but she saw it. Thursday came and went in work and preparation. Danny arrived mid-morning the 16-year-old Ethan had mentioned, and turned out to be exactly as described, quiet, capable, and so thoroughly alarmed by Clara's presence that he addressed all his comments to the fence post nearest to her for the first hour. "He'll get over it." Ethan said low when they were out of earshot. I know, she said. He's sweet. Ethan made a sound she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to a laugh. Danny got over it by noon when Clara handed him a sandwich without ceremony and asked him a direct question about the eastern fence he'd repaired last spring. And he answered because the question was practical and needed answering, and she was looking at him like someone who actually wanted to hear what he knew. After that, he talked to her like a person, which was all she'd ever asked of anyone. In the afternoon, while Ethan and Danny were out with the cattle, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's notebook and Henry's list and her own documents and began building the timeline. It was the kind of work she'd done before, the slow, precise work of putting facts in order and letting the pattern emerge from the order rather than imposing one on top. It was the kind of work that required patience and a particular tolerance for sitting with uncertainty until the shape of things became clear. The shape that was becoming clear was worse than she'd initially thought. The first incidents in the valley. The first fence cuts. The first mentions of water. Irregularities predated Holloway's arrival by nearly 6 months, which meant either someone else had been laying the groundwork before he came, or Holloway had been operating through intermediaries before he made his formal appearance. Either way, this wasn't improvised. This had been planned. She was still sitting with that realization when Ethan came in from the day's work, and he took one look at her face and said, "What did you find?" She told him. He sat down across from her and looked at the timeline she'd built. 6 months, he said. At least, she said. And the way the incidents track, they started furthest from your land and moved closer. It's systematic, like someone mapping a route. He looked at the documents for a long moment. Marsh, he said. Before Holloway arrived, Marsh was here before Holloway. Clara looked at him sharply. You're sure? I saw him once, maybe 8 months ago, Ethan said slowly. Riding the ridgeline. I thought he was a surveyor. He had equipment with him. I didn't know who he worked for at the time. Clara felt something go cold and precise in her chest. That's when it started, she said. Yes, Ethan. She kept her voice steady. They have a survey of this land, a private survey, which means they know the water system better than anyone except you. He met her eyes. Which means she said, they have a plan that they've already been executing for 8 months, and Friday's meeting isn't a negotiation. No, he said. It's a deadline, she said. The candle between them burned steadily. Outside, the summer wind moved through the grass on the ridge. Ethan looked at the documents. Then he looked at her. I need to talk to someone in Helena, he said. Before Friday. Yes, she said. Which means I need to ride out tomorrow morning, early. I know. You'll be here alone. I'll be here with Danny, she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was more than concern and less than what either of them had named. Clara, he said. I'm not fragile, she said quietly. I've been handling things alone for 2 years. One day won't break me. I know you're not fragile, he said. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not what I'm worried about. She looked at him. Then what? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I just want to come back and have you still be here, he said. It was the most unguarded thing he'd said since the livery stable. She knew what it cost him, not because he was weak, but because he was the kind of man who had learned to hold things close. She held his gaze. I'll be here, she said. He nodded once. Then he reached out and straightened the edge of the documents on the table, a small, unnecessary gesture that wasn't about the documents at all. Get some sleep, he said. I'm leaving at 4. I'll have coffee ready at 3:30, she said. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. She watched him go, and she sat with the documents for another hour, and outside the summer dark settled over the Montana mountains like something patient and vast. She was not afraid. She was something else entirely. something she hadn't felt since before Caldwell, since before Gerald Forsyth, since before 2 years of arriving in new places and being looked at sideways, and learning to keep everything important locked in the false bottom of a worn leather suitcase. She was in the middle of something that mattered. She was working alongside someone who treated her work as real. She was building something that wasn't finished yet, and the not yet finishedness of it felt for the first time in a very long time like possibility rather than threat. She blew out the candle at midnight and went to bed. At 3:20 in the morning, she was awake and the coffee was on. And when Ethan came down the stairs in the dark and saw the light in the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway for just a moment, long enough for her to see something cross his face that he hadn't put there on purpose. Then he came in and sat down, and they drank coffee in the quiet dark before he rode south toward Helena. And neither of them said what that moment in the doorway had been, but neither of them forgot it either. Ethan rode back from Helena on a Friday afternoon with mud on his boots and something careful behind his eyes that Clara read the moment he came through the door. She was at the table. The timeline was still spread out in front of her. She'd added 2 more pages since he left, connections she'd found between dates in Ruth's notebook and patterns in Henry's list that she hadn't seen the first night. She looked at him. He hung his hat. He didn't speak immediately, which told her the news wasn't simple. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you something." "I don't need Ethan." She was already at the stove. "Sit down." He sat. She poured coffee and set it in front of him and sat back down across the table and waited. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "The Federal Land Office in Helena has a record of a survey conducted in this valley 14 months ago," he said. "Private commission, paid for by a land investment corporation registered in Chicago." Clara went still. "The corporation's name," she said, "Halloran Western Land and Water Trust." She reached across the table and pulled one of her documents toward her. Her own handwriting 2 years old. She turned it to face him and put her finger on a line near the bottom. He read it. His jaw tightened. "Halloran," he said. "Forsyth's investment partner," she said quietly. "It's in the letter I kept from the Caldwell County Clerk's office. He mentioned the name twice. I didn't know what it meant then." She looked at him steadily. "It's the same organization, Ethan. Forsyth Holloway Marsh, they're all operating under the same trust." He set down the cup. "It's not just this valley," she said. "I don't think it ever was. I think they've been doing this in multiple territories, moving west as the land opens up, finding water sources, destroying the claims around them, buying cheap." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that precedes a decision rather than following one. "The man I spoke to in Helena," he said. "His name is Marshall Graves. He's the Federal Land Office supervisor. He took the survey record seriously." He paused. "He also told me something else." "What?" "He said there's already an inquiry open," Ethan said. "Not on this valley. On a situation in Colorado 18 months ago. Ranchers losing water, buying pressure. One property owner who tried to file a federal complaint and was subsequently—" He stopped. Clara looked at him. "What happened to him?" "His barn burned," Ethan said simply. 2 weeks after he filed. The room was very quiet. "Graves said the Colorado inquiry stalled because the evidence was local," Ethan continued. "The trust operates through proxies. Holloway never touches anything directly. Marsh never touches anything directly. It's always men nobody can trace back." "But if you connect Colorado to Caldwell to this valley," Clara said, "then it's not a local dispute anymore," Ethan said. "Then it's a federal pattern." He looked at her. "He wants to come here, Graves. He wants to see what you have." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet. More like the ground becoming slightly more solid under her feet. "When?" she said. "He needs 2 weeks to arrange it quietly," Ethan said. "He doesn't want Holloway to know federal attention is here until we're ready." 2 weeks, she said. "Yes." She looked at the documents spread across the table. We can do that, she said. We build the case as tight as we can make it. We get written statements from Henry and Ruth. We document the spring activity. She paused. And you go to that meeting tonight. He looked at her. Tonight. The Holloway meeting was tonight, she said. Did you forget? No, he said. I was hoping you had. Ethan. She held his gaze. You have to go. If you don't show up, Marsh will ride up here tomorrow to find out why. We cannot have Marsh on this property right now. He looked at the table, at the documents, at 2 years of her careful, determined work. If I go to that meeting, he said slowly, and Holloway reads me wrong if he decides I'm a problem instead of a stubborn holdout, then we move faster, she said. But you won't give him that. You know how to be unreadable, Ethan. I've watched you do it. Every time someone in town looks at you sideways, you give them absolutely nothing. She paused. Give Holloway the same thing. A man who might be bought. A man who hasn't made up his mind. A man who needs more time. He looked at her for a long moment. You trust me to do that, he said. I trust you completely, she said. It was the first time she'd said it that directly. She saw it register in his face briefly quietly, and then he stood up and picked up his hat. I'll be back before dark, he said. I'll be here, she said. He was not back before dark. Clara kept herself busy. She fed the horses, she made supper and kept it warm. She sat with the documents for another hour, then put them away carefully, and sat by the window instead, because sitting with the documents felt like borrowing trouble, and she had enough already. Danny had gone home at 4. She had not told him to stay. She was beginning to regret that. At 7:30, she heard a horse on the ridge road, and her whole body went alert before she even reached the window. It was Ethan, alone. She had the door open before he reached the porch. He came up the steps with the measured, controlled movement of a man who was carrying something difficult and had not yet decided what to do with it. She stepped back to let him in. He stood in the middle of the room and didn't speak for a moment. Tell me, she said. He turned to face her. Holloway was at the meeting, he said. Him and Marsh and 2 other men I didn't recognize, and 3 ranchers I didn't expect, men I thought were holdouts. Henderson, Baxter, Crane. They've sold. They're selling, he said. Tonight might have been the signing. His voice was controlled, but she heard what was underneath it. It was not a meeting for negotiation. It was a meeting to demonstrate that I'm the last one standing. Clara said nothing. Holloway is not what I expected, Ethan said. He's quiet, soft-spoken. He looks like a banker, not a land thief. He offered me coffee and asked about my cattle operation with what sounded like genuine interest. He paused. And then he said very calmly, very pleasantly, that he was prepared to offer me one final figure for the Walker property, a figure that is, I'll admit, more money than I've ever seen in one number. And when you said no, I didn't say no, Ethan said. I said I needed more time to think. She studied his face. That's what I asked you to say. I know. He sat down. He said, of course, take your time, but I'd encourage you not to wait too long. Summer turns to fall quickly in the mountains, and fall can get very difficult for a single operation. The threat was thin as paper and clear as glass. He knows we're a single operation, Clara said. He knows everything about this ranch, Ethan said. He knew the size of my herd. He knew when I bought the north pasture. He knew... He stopped. She waited. He knew I'd recently gotten married, Ethan said. He congratulated me, said he hoped my wife was settling in well. He looked at Clara. And then Marsh said he'd had the pleasure of meeting her. And Holloway said, still very pleasant, still smiling, that he hoped she was enjoying the Montana mountains. That women who came to this territory from difficult circumstances deserved every chance to build a stable life. The room felt very still. He knows who I am, Clara said. I don't know how much he knows, Ethan said. But he knows enough to say that. He met her eyes. Clara, if he's connected to Forsyth, if he's communicated with Forsyth, and Forsyth has described you, then he knows about the documents, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it was real, and she didn't pretend otherwise. Then we're not working on a 2-week timeline anymore, she said. No, he said. We're not. How quickly can you get word to Graves? I can ride out Monday morning, he said. If he can come sooner. He needs to come sooner, she said. We need to get everything to him before Holloway decides patience isn't working. She stood up and went to the kitchen, not because she needed anything, but because she needed to move. The documents are the only thing standing between him and this land, if he knows I have them. He's going to try to get them, Ethan said, or destroy them. She turned around. Or discredit them. She looked at him steadily. That's what Forsyth did. He didn't steal the survey. He paid someone to refile it under a different record number so the original couldn't be found. The document still existed technically. It was just buried. She paused. Holloway won't come here himself. He'll never come here himself. But he'll send someone. Ethan stood up. I want you to take the originals, he said. Not here. Somewhere he can't reach them. Where? He thought for a moment. Henry Briggs, he said. His place is on the western slope furthest from Holloway's land, and Henry is... He paused. Henry is the kind of man who will sit on his porch with a rifle if he needs to. You trust him? I trust him more than anyone else in this valley right now. She looked at the documents on the table. 2 years of careful keeping. The false bottom of a worn leather suitcase. Every piece of evidence she'd managed to hold on to through Salina and Dodge City and Pueblo, and 3 months of Silver Creek. All right, she said. Tomorrow morning. Tonight, he said. She looked at him. I want them out of this house tonight, he said. His voice was level, but she heard the urgency underneath it, not panic, but the particular alertness of a man who has decided that waiting is no longer a safe option. She held his gaze. Give me 10 minutes, she said. 10. They rode to Henry Briggs's place in the dark. Henry met them at the gate with a lantern, and no surprise whatsoever, as if he'd been half expecting company. When Ethan explained, Henry listened without interruption. When Ethan finished, Henry looked at the leather satchel Clara was holding and said, Give it here. She handed it to him. He tucked it under his arm like it was a bag of feed corn. I've got a place, he said. Been keeping important papers safe for 40 years. Nobody's found it yet. Thank you, Henry, Clara said. He looked at her with the direct, unvarnished regard she'd come to appreciate. You done good, young woman, he said. Most people who get hit the way you got hit don't keep fighting. They just take the blow and go quiet. She didn't know what to say to that. We'll need to move quickly, she said finally. Ethan is going to reach out to the federal contact. If we can get a marshal here within the week, I'll be ready, Henry said simply. And that was that. The ride back was quiet. Halfway up the ridge road, Ethan said, I have to tell you something. She looked at him. At the meeting tonight, he said. When Holloway made that comment about women from difficult circumstances, he paused. I almost said what I actually thought. What stopped you? I thought about what you said, he said. About patience being harder than speaking. You were right, and He stopped again. She waited. I want to make sure you know that what he implied, Ethan said carefully. The way he used your past as a tool to make a point that wasn't something I was going to let stand without response. I held back because you asked me to, and because you were right that it was the smarter move. He looked at her directly. But it cost something. Clara was quiet for a moment. I know, she said softly. I know it did. I don't care what happened in Caldwell, he said. I don't care what Forsyth said about you, or what Holloway knows or thinks he knows. None of that is who you are. She felt it settle in her chest, not with the rush of sentiment, but with the slow, solid weight of something true. Ethan, I'm not finished, he said quietly. I brought you here because I needed a partner. I thought that meant someone who could work the land and manage the house. He paused. What I didn't expect was someone who could read a land fraud 2 states away from a 2-year-old document and build a federal case in 4 days. He looked at her. I want you to know that I see what you're doing, and I see what it costs you to keep doing it. She was quiet for a long time. Nobody has said that to me in a very long time, she said finally. Her voice was even. She kept it even. Thank you. He nodded. They rode the rest of the way in the good quiet. The next 3 days moved fast and careful. Ethan sent word to Marshal Graves through a writer he trusted, a man named Calloway who drove the mail route south, and asked no unnecessary questions. The message was brief and factual. The timeline had changed, the federal connection was confirmed, they needed him sooner. Clara worked with Ruth Morrison on a written statement, specific dated signed, documenting every incident on her property since the fence cutting began. Ruth wrote in a firm, small hand and did not minimize or dramatize. The statement was 4 pages, and it was devastating in its plainness. Henry added his own 2 pages, dry as old wood and twice as hard to argue with. Danny, who had been watching the situation develop with the wide-eyed alertness of a young man who was learning what the adult world actually looked like underneath its polite surface, came to Ethan on the second day and said he had something to add. Ethan brought him to Clara. Danny sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and said, "Last spring, before you came, ma'am, I was out fixing the north fence and I saw 2 men at the spring. They weren't from here. They had equipment, measuring rods, I think. I didn't know what it meant, so I didn't say anything." He looked at Ethan, then back at Clara. "I should have said something." "You didn't know," Clara said. "I know now," he said. "So I'm saying it now." She looked at him with something she hoped he could read as respect, because she meant it as exactly that. "Can you write down what you saw, date, time, what the men looked like, what they were doing?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then do that," she said. "And Danny, that matters. What you saw matters." He nodded, still holding his hat, still young, but sitting a little straighter. That evening, Clara added his account to the file she was building. It confirmed that the survey of the spring had begun more than a year ago, which pushed the premeditation back further than even she had calculated. She was writing the final summary page when she heard a horse on the ridge road. One horse moving fast. She stood up. Ethan was in the barn. She crossed to the door and opened it just enough to see the rider coming up the road and felt her stomach drop because it was Marsh. Not a social call. Not at this hour, moving that fast. She pulled the door closed. She went to the barn door and said, "Ethan, Marsh is coming." He was at her side in 4 steps. He looked at her face, then he looked at the house. "The copies." "On the table," she said. He moved past her. She followed. They were back inside, and the papers were in the kitchen drawer, and Clara was at the stove with a pot she'd pulled from the shelf by the time Marsh's horse stopped in the yard. Ethan answered the door. Marsh stood on the porch with the particular kind of casual ease that is practiced, not natural. "Walker," he said. "Sorry to come by so late." "What do you want, Marsh?" Ethan said. "No pleasantries." Marsh looked past him. Clara stood at the stove with her back to the door. "Just a quick word," Marsh said. "Mr. Holloway wanted me to follow up on your conversation Friday. He's concerned he may have come across as pressuring, and that wasn't his intention." "His intention was plain enough," Ethan said. Marsh smiled. "He's a direct man. He'd be the first to admit it." He paused. "He asked me to let you know the offer stands, and that he genuinely hopes you'll take it because he'd hate to see things become complicated." "Complicated how?" Ethan said. "Oh, you know how things get," Marsh said. "Summer's ending. Fall can be unpredictable. Cattle operations need reliable water." He kept the smile easy. "He just wants to make sure the Walker Ranch is in a secure position going into winter." "How thoughtful," Ethan said flatly. Marsh's gaze moved to Clara again. She kept her back to him, kept her hands moving on the stove, gave him exactly nothing. "Mrs. Walker," Marsh said. She turned around. She met his eyes calmly. "Evening," she said. "Hope we haven't disturbed your supper." "Not at all," she said. He looked at her for a moment too long. She held his gaze without blinking. I hear you came to us from Kansas, he said pleasantly. I've lived in several places, she said. Montana suits me. Funny thing, he said. Mr. Holloway has business associates in Kansas. Small world. It is, she agreed. Her voice was perfectly steady. Give Mr. Holloway my regards. Marsh smiled. I'll do that. He looked back at Ethan. Think about the offer, Walker. Sooner is better than later. He rode away. Ethan closed the door. He turned around and looked at Clara. She realized her hands were shaking not much, but enough that she set down the pot before he could see it. She was 2 seconds too slow. He saw. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hands over hers on the pot handle, and the steadiness of his grip was so immediate and so complete that she felt her whole body settle around it like something finding its footing. He knows, she said quietly. He suspects. Ethan said. There's a difference. Not much of one. Enough of one. He didn't let go of her hands. Graves needs to be here before the end of next week. If Calloway got through, Calloway always gets through, he said. He'll be here. She looked at Ethan's hands over hers, at the steadiness in them, at the particular kind of strength that was less about size and more about the decision to hold something carefully instead of hard. Marsh is going to come back, she said. Yes. And when he does, it won't be for a conversation. No, he said. She looked up at him. We need to warn Ruth and Henry. First thing tomorrow morning, he said. But tonight, he paused. Tonight, you're going to eat something and not sit with those documents anymore. They're in the drawer. Henry has the originals. There is nothing else we can do tonight. She looked at him. You've been running on 2 years of fear, he said quietly. One night of not running won't break anything. It was the truest thing he'd said to her yet. She felt it in the way that true things feel, not comforting exactly, but honest. All right, she said. He released her hands. She made supper and they ate it, and for a while they talked about nothing important, about Danny's growing confidence around her, about the north pasture fence that needed attention, about the copy of Walden on the shelf, and whether Thoreau had ever actually had to repair a fence, or if he'd just written about it poetically. He built his own cabin, Ethan said. Building and maintaining are different things, she said. That's true of most things, he said. She looked at him. And something passed between them in the ordinary kitchen light, something that wasn't named and didn't need to be yet, but that was real, and they both knew it. Marshal Graves arrived on Thursday. Not with fanfare, not with a badge visible or a posse behind him. He arrived as a man in a plain coat, on a plain horse, introduced to Ethan by Calloway on the South Road, and came up to the ranch with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a federal officer, who had long since learned that discretion was worth more than authority in situations like this. He was 60 years old with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had read a great many documents and a great many people, and had learned to tell the difference between evidence and noise. He sat at the kitchen table. Clara laid out everything. She walked him through it the same way she'd walked Ethan through it, the first night, plain-ordered, factual. She didn't editorialize. She let the timeline speak for itself. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Walker, Ethan said from the doorway, in a tone that was not aggressive, but was entirely clear. Graves glanced at him. Mrs. Walker, he corrected. The survey from Caldwell, the federal marker notation. Are you prepared to testify to the chain of custody that you had this document in your possession since before the county clerk's office reported the original missing? Yes, she said. You understand that Forsyth's lawyers will challenge that? Yes, she said. I kept a letter from the clerk's deputy dated 10 days before the original was reported missing. He acknowledged the existence of the survey in writing. He was trying to warn me, I think, without putting himself at risk. She paused. His name was Amos Pierce. He died the following winter. Influenza, according to the report. She held Graves's gaze. I don't know what to make of that, and I'm not making claims I can't support. But I have the letter." Graves was quiet. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "in 22 years of federal land work, I have seen documentation this thorough exactly twice." He paused. Both times, it was a woman who kept it. She didn't smile. "Men have the luxury of trusting the system to remember for them," she said. "Women who have been through what I've been through learn very quickly that you keep your own records." Graves looked at Ethan. "Your wife," he said, "has built most of our case." "I know," Ethan said. "You understand this is going to be a federal proceeding. Holloway has money, and lawyers, and political connections. This will not be simple or quick." "I've been fighting this for 2 years," Clara said. "I'm not concerned about quick." Graves nodded slowly. "There's one more thing," he said. His voice shifted just slightly, and she felt it before he said the next sentence. "I sent a query to Kansas before I came," he said, "about the Caldwell situation, about Gerald Forsythe." He looked at her steadily. "He knows you're here, Mrs. Walker. We believe he received information about your location approximately 3 weeks ago." The room went very still. 3 weeks ago was when she had sent the note to Ethan Walker Box 12 Silver Creek Post Office. Someone had been watching the post office. "He's been watching for me," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "We believe so," Graves said. "Which means Holloway isn't just a separate operation that happens to use the same methods. He was expecting you." Ethan took one step forward from the doorway. Just one. Clara heard it. "Expecting her specifically," he said. "We don't know the extent of the coordination," Graves said carefully. "But the timing is difficult to explain otherwise." Clara sat with that for a moment. The particular weight of it. 2 years of moving, and she had thought she was finding a way forward, and all along there had been someone watching the mail in Silver Creek. She thought about the notice on the post office board. Seeking a wife. She had told herself she pulled it down because of the word fair, because of a man who made promises without ornamentation. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at her, and his face was doing the thing it rarely did, showing something without editing it first. Not anger, not pity. Something closer to what she'd seen in the dark kitchen at 3:30 in the morning, when he'd come downstairs and found the light on and the coffee ready. Something that was not yet named, but was very much present. "They thought I'd run," she said, quietly, mostly to herself. "If Holloway made enough pressure and Forsythe was in the background pulling strings, they thought I'd pick up my suitcase and leave." She looked at the table. "Same play, new location. They've done it before." "Yes," Graves said. "They didn't expect me to have the Federal Survey notation," she said. "No. They didn't expect anyone to connect Caldwell to this valley." "No," Graves said. "They didn't." She looked up at him. "Then we've already surprised them," she said. "That's our advantage. Let's not waste it." Graves looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Here's what we're going to do." He began to lay it out, and Clara listened with the precise recording attention she'd honed over 2 years of having no one to rely on but herself. And as he talked, she was aware of Ethan at her side, not hovering, not managing, just present in the solid, unhurried way that she had come to understand was simply how he was, and she felt the thing in her chest that she'd been keeping careful for weeks shift slightly further out of its hiding place. She did not let herself name it yet, but she stopped trying quite so hard to put it back. Graves left before dusk with a plan, a timeline, and copies of everything. Clara walked him to his horse. He shook her hand with the brief, serious grip of someone who meant it. "You built something here," he said. "Out of very little over a very long time. That's not nothing." "It's not done yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's real." She watched him ride down the ridge road and stood there for a moment after he disappeared. Behind her, she heard Ethan's boot on the porch step. She turned around. He was standing with his arms at his sides, looking at her with the unguarded directness that appeared in him sometimes when he wasn't thinking about maintaining distance. "You all right?" he said. She thought about the answer. She thought about Forsyth and the post office and 3 weeks of someone watching for her name. She thought about 2 years and a false-bottom suitcase and arriving in places where no one looked at her like someone worth trusting. She thought about Ethan Walker in the dark kitchen at 3:30 in the morning and the way he'd stopped in the doorway when he saw the light on and what had crossed his face before he put it away. "Ask me again in a week," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "ask me then." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. She came up the porch steps and passed him into the house, and his hand brushed her arm as she passed just briefly, just a moment, and neither of them commented on it. But the warmth of it stayed. The week after Graves left was the quietest week Clara had known since arriving in Montana. That was the thing about danger. When it was patient, it didn't announce itself. It just waited, and the waiting had its own particular weight, the kind that pressed on the chest at 3 in the morning and made ordinary sounds feel significant. She slept lightly. She woke early. She kept working. Ethan said nothing about the way she checked the window each morning before she started the fire, or the way she listened for horses on the ridge road before she went out to the well. He simply adjusted his own patterns to match hers a little closer, a little more present without making it something that needed to be discussed. That was its own kind of language. She was learning to hear it. Danny came every day now without being asked. He didn't say why. He simply showed up earlier than he used to and stayed later. And one morning Clara found him sitting on the porch before dawn with his rifle across his knees and a thermos of coffee he'd brought from home. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. She went back inside and made him breakfast. On Tuesday, Marsh came back. Not to the ranch this time. He was waiting in Silver Creek when Ethan rode in for supplies, standing outside the general store, with the studied casualness of a man who wants you to think the encounter is accidental. Ethan told her about it that evening, word for word, the way he'd learned to do, because she listened to the spaces between words as much as the words themselves. He said Holloway's offer was being withdrawn at the end of the month, Ethan said. Said after that they couldn't guarantee what the market would bear for a mountain ranch with uncertain water access. Uncertain water access, Clara repeated. Yes. They're moving faster, she said. They know we've been talking to the other ranchers. They're setting a deadline before we can build any more of a coalition. That's what I thought, he said. What did you tell him? I told him I'd consider it, Ethan said. Same as before. He paused. He didn't like that as much this time. Because last time he thought it meant you were softening, she said. This time he's starting to wonder if it means something else. Yes. She looked at him. Did he say anything about me? Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. He said he hoped my wife was finding Silver Creek agreeable, that it was a friendly town for people who came to it honestly. The emphasis was so clear it barely counted as a threat. It was more like a statement of intent. He's trying to rattle you, she said. Through me. I know what he's trying to do, Ethan said. His voice was level, but she heard the controlled anger underneath it, the kind of anger that is more dangerous than the kind that shouts because it doesn't spend itself. Ethan. She looked at him directly. Whatever he says about me, whatever Holloway tells him to say, it doesn't change anything. You know what happened in Caldwell. You have the documents. You know who I am. He looked at her. I know who you are, he said quietly. That was never the question. She held his gaze for a moment. Then let him talk, she said. People who are desperate say desperate things. He nodded, but the set of his shoulders didn't entirely ease. The letter from Graves arrived on Wednesday, carried by Calloway on the southbound route. 1 page, brief. Federal office language stripped of anything that could be read badly if intercepted. The matter we discussed is proceeding. Additional documentation from the Colorado situation has been located. We have a meeting with the Territorial Commissioner scheduled for the 14th. Your presence and the presence of your associates would strengthen the proceeding considerably. Bring everything. G. Clara read it twice. Then she read it again. The 14th, Ethan said. That's 9 days, she said. Can we get Henry and Ruth to Helena by then? Henry will go, she said immediately. Ruth? She thought about it. Ruth hasn't left her property since her husband died. She won't want to leave the cattle. Danny can watch the cattle, Ethan said. Clara looked at him. You've already thought about this. I've been thinking about it since Graves left, he said. He sat down at the table. Here's what worries me. Holloway's deadline is end of the month. Graves's meeting is the 14th. If Holloway gets word that there's a federal meeting happening before we get to Helena, he'll act before the 14th, she said. Yes. Then we leave before he has time to find out, she said. How fast can we move? He thought about it. If we leave Saturday, you, me, Henry, Ruth, we can make Helena by Monday evening. That gives us 3 days before the meeting. Time enough to prepare with Graves, he said. Time enough to go through everything one more time. She nodded. I'll ride to Ruth's tomorrow. I'll talk to Henry, he said. And I'll ask Calloway to get word to Graves that we're coming early. She looked at the letter on the table. Ethan, she said. Yes. If the commissioner rules in our favor, if this goes the way Graves thinks it can go, it doesn't just protect this valley. She paused. It potentially reopens the Caldwell case. It potentially puts Forsyth in front of a federal proceeding. He looked at her steadily. I know. That means there are people with a great deal of money who have a very strong interest in this not going well, she said. Once we're on the road to Helena, we're visible. We're not protected by this ridge, or Henry's porch, or Danny and his coffee thermos. I know, he said again. I want to make sure you know what you're riding into, she said. This is my fight. It started with me. You didn't ask for Clara. His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. Stop. She stopped. This is my valley, he said. Those are my neighbors whose wells are going dry. That is my spring being surveyed by men who don't have the right to be within 50 yards of it. He held her gaze. And you are my wife. The word landed differently than it had the other times she'd used it functionally practically as explanation. When he said it, it had weight. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. We leave Saturday, he said. Saturday? She agreed. Ruth Morrison took exactly 4 minutes to say yes. Clara had expected more negotiation. She'd prepared for it, had thought through every argument for why Ruth needed to make the trip, had anticipated the objections about the cattle, about leaving her property unguarded, about the long road, and the vulnerability of being away. Ruth listened to about 45 seconds of it and said, What time's Saturday? Clara stopped. Dawn, she said. I'll be ready at first light, Ruth said. She looked at Clara with the steady eyes of a woman who had been waiting for something to fight back with. I've been watching them cut my fences for 4 months. I have been patient long enough. Clara felt something in her chest that was partly admiration and partly the particular solidarity of women who have been ground down by the same kind of machine from different directions. We'll come by for you on the way south, Clara said. Ruth nodded. Then she looked at Clara with something more personal. Does Walker know what he's got? She said. Clara looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, most men in this territory would have sent their wife to town and handled this themselves, Ruth said. The way he talks about you, about what you found, what you built, that's not a man who thinks you're useful equipment. That's a man who knows he's working alongside someone. She paused. That's rarer than water in a drought, Miss Clara. Clara didn't answer immediately. I'm starting to understand that, she said finally. Friday night, the night before they left, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the Montana quiet, the particular stillness of high country in late summer, when the heat of the day had lifted, and the night air moved through the grass with a sound like something breathing. She thought about Gerald Forsyth in his comfortable house in Caldwell. She thought about the county clerk's deputy, who had tried to warn her in a letter and was dead of influenza by spring. She thought about the Patterson family, who had sold under pressure, and the wife who couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. She thought about Ruth Morrison fixing fences alone in the dark. She thought about a post office board and a piece of brown paper and the words, "I am not an easy man, but I am a fair one," and the particular moment when she had decided that fair was worth more than easy. She heard Ethan's door. She heard him cross the hall, not toward the stairs, but stopping just outside her door. A pause. Then his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the door. "Clara." "I'm awake," she said. A moment passed. "You all right?" he said. She looked at the ceiling. "I'm thinking," she said, "about tomorrow." "We're going to be all right," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know we've done everything right. We've got the documents, we've got witnesses, we've got a federal marshal and a territorial commissioner who has no connection to Holloway." A pause. "And I know you. And you don't do things halfway." She was quiet for a moment. "Ethan," she said. "When this is over, ask me then," he said. An echo of what she'd said to him days ago on the porch. He'd remembered it exactly. She felt something warm move through her chest. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. She heard him move back to his room. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in a week, she slept. They left at dawn. Ethan and Clara picking up Ruth at the base of her drive, and Henry at his gate, and the four of them riding south with the mountains at their backs, and 2 years of evidence in a leather satchel that Henry kept strapped to his body like something sacred. The road south was long and open, and Clara was aware of every rider they passed, every fork in the road, every place where the terrain narrowed. Ethan rode with the alert, unhurried watchfulness she'd seen in him on the ridge, the kind that doesn't look like watchfulness, because it never quite stops moving. They made camp the first night at a place Henry knew 20 miles south of Silver Creek off the main road. Around the fire, Ruth and Henry talked about the valley, about what it had been before Holloway, about the ranchers who had built it piece by piece over 30 years. They talked about people who had sold, and people who had held on, and the particular sadness of watching a community being disassembled from the outside. Clara listened and said little. Ethan sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he listened too, and occasionally he added something, and twice he looked at her sideways with a quiet attentiveness that she felt more than saw. When Henry and Ruth had rolled into their blankets, Ethan and Clara sat with the dying fire for a while. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm always quiet," she said. "Different kind of quiet tonight," he said. She looked at the fire. "I keep thinking about what Graves said, that they were expecting me." She paused. "That Forsyth had been watching for me." She let out a slow breath. "For 2 years I thought I was running. I was actually being tracked." Ethan said nothing. "It should make me feel worse," she said. "It should feel like all that moving was pointless." She paused. "It doesn't, though, because every place I went, I kept the documents. I kept adding to them. And every piece I kept led here," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze in the firelight. "Clara," he said, "what you said about your fight, about how it started with you." He paused. "You were right. But where something starts doesn't determine where it belongs." He looked at the fire. "You walked into my life carrying something that turned out to be the thing that could protect everything I've spent 13 years building." He looked back at her. "I don't think that's a burden you brought to my door. I think that's—" He stopped, started again. "I think that's what it looks like when two people find each other at exactly the right time." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're not as bad at this as you think you are," she said softly. The corner of his mouth moved. "Don't tell anyone." She felt the warmth of it move through her, the humor, the honesty, the particular ease of being known by someone who had started as a stranger and become something she didn't have a word for yet, but trusted completely. "Get some sleep," she said. We've got a long day tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said. They reached Helena on Monday evening as Graves had told them to expect, and Graves was waiting at the edge of town with Calloway and a man Clara didn't recognize, who turned out to be the Deputy Territorial Commissioner, a serious-faced man named Aldous Reeves, who shook hands briefly and said almost nothing. That was all right. She wasn't there for conversation. They spent Monday night in a boarding house that Graves had arranged secure low profile. Not the kind of place where anyone would expect 4 ranchers from a mountain valley to be staying. Clara sat with Graves and Reeves at a table in the back room for 2 hours walking through the complete file from the beginning. Graves had brought what he'd gathered from Colorado. Another timeline, another set of incidents, another community that had been systematically dismantled. The methods were identical. The language in the property transfer documents was nearly word-for-word matching. When Clara laid her Caldwell survey beside the Colorado records, Reeves looked at both documents for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "How many states?" "That we can document," Clara said. 3. Kansas, Colorado, Montana. She paused. "I believe there are others." "You believe or you have evidence?" "I have partial records from 2 other territories," she said. "Not enough to file on alone, but enough to support a pattern argument once the 3 confirmed cases are established." Reeves looked at Graves. "She knows what she's talking about," Graves said. "I can see that," Reeves said. He looked back at Clara. "Mrs. Walker, what is it you want from this proceeding?" "I want Holloway's operations in the Montana Valley halted immediately," she said. "I want the water rights on the Walker property and the neighboring claims confirmed under federal survey law. I want a formal inquiry opened into the Halloran Western Land and Water Trust operating across state lines." She paused. "And I want Gerald Forsyth in Caldwell, Kansas to understand that the documents he thought were buried are about to be read into a federal record." Reeves studied her. "That last part," he said carefully, "is more personal than procedural." "Yes," she said. "It is." Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then unexpectedly he said, "Good." She looked at him. "A woman who wants justice for herself and for everyone else at the same time is more credible than one who only wants one or the other," he said simply. He closed the folder in front of him. "We'll convene at 9 tomorrow morning." The meeting on Tuesday was not what Clara had imagined during 2 years of hoping for it. She had imagined something dramatic, a courtroom perhaps, a gallery of witnesses, the kind of formal confrontation where the truth arrives like a verdict. What happened instead was quieter and more methodical, and in its own way more powerful. Reeves convened a formal territorial commission hearing in a plain government office room. Present were Graves Reeves, 2 government surveyors. Reeves had brought from the land office, Clara Ethan Henry Briggs, Ruth Morrison, and a clerk whose pen moved steadily across paper for 4 hours. Clara presented the case, methodically, completely. She walked through the Caldwell survey, the chain of custody, the federal marker notation, the connection to Halloran Western, the Colorado pattern, the Montana Valley timeline, Danny's witness account of the spring survey, Ruth's documented incidents, Henry's recorded water levels. She had done this once before in a county clerk's office in Caldwell, Kansas, with documents just as strong in front of a man whose brother-in-law was Gerald Forsyth. This was different. She felt the difference in the room, in the way Reeves listened without his expression doing anything except absorbing information, in the way the surveyors leaned over the federal marker notation and spoke to each other in the precise technical language of men who understood what they were looking at. She felt it most strongly when one of the surveyors looked up from the Caldwell survey and said, "This notation is from the 1871 Federal Homestead Survey Series. If this document is authentic, and it appears to be, it predates any subsequent private survey by at least 4 years. That makes every land transfer built on a conflicting boundary legally questionable." Reeves wrote something. Graves looked at Clara. She kept her face composed. Henry Briggs testified about the valley and the water patterns and 40 years of watching the land work the way it was supposed to work. He was unhurried and precise and about as moving as good lumber, solid, reliable, impossible to argue with. Ruth Morrison testified about the fence cuttings and the water levels and the cattle losses and the silence of the county sheriff. Her voice didn't shake once. It was late afternoon by the time Reeves set down his pen. He looked at the assembled group. "I'm prepared to issue an immediate injunction halting any further land transactions in the relevant valley area pending full federal review," he said. "I'm also prepared to refer the Halloran Western matter to the Federal Land Fraud Division for investigation across all 3 documented territories." He paused. "The Colorado case can now be reopened in conjunction with this finding." He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "the Caldwell situation requires a separate proceeding in Kansas federal jurisdiction. But with this documentation and the connection to Halloran now established, I have no doubt that the Kansas federal office will open that proceeding." He paused. "Gerald Forsythe is going to have a very uncomfortable winter." Clara sat very still. She had spent 2 years carrying the weight of Caldwell. The anger of it, the injustice of it, the exhausting daily work of keeping the truth alive when everyone around her was willing to let it die. She had not realized until this moment how heavy it had been. She felt Ethan's hand cover hers on the table. She had not realized he'd reached for it. Or maybe she had somewhere underneath everything else because she didn't startle. She just turned her hand over and held on. "Thank you," she said to Reeves. Her voice was steady. She made sure of that. "Thank yourself," he said. "You built this." They were outside an hour later in the ordinary afternoon air of Helena, Montana, and the world was still the same world it had been that morning, but it felt different in the specific way that things feel different when something long carried is finally set down. Henry put on his hat and said, "Well, good day's work." Ruth laughed, a short, released sound, like something that had been held in for months. Ethan stood beside Clara. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the unhidden expression she'd come to understand was his most honest face, the one that appeared when he'd stopped calculating what to show and was simply showing it. "How are you?" he said. She thought about the question seriously. "I think I might be all right," she said. "That's the first time I've heard you say that." "It's the first time I've meant it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said, "when we get back to the ranch—" "Ask me then," she said. He stopped. "You keep saying that," he said. "Because you keep starting sentences you don't finish," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted that rare brief opening that he mostly kept guarded. "When we get back to the ranch," he said with deliberate patience, "I want to finish this conversation properly. In our kitchen, without federal commissioners in the next room." He paused. "Is that acceptable?" She felt the warmth of it move through her all the way down to her boots. "That's acceptable," she said. He nodded once, then he turned to help Henry get Ruth's horse sorted out. She stood in the afternoon light of Helena, Montana, and for a moment she just breathed. The injunction was signed. The federal review was opening. Forsythe's name was in a federal record for the first time in 2 years. Holloway was going to find out probably tomorrow that the deadline he'd set for the Walker Ranch was the least of his problems. And Ethan Walker was going to have a conversation with her in their kitchen. She had arrived in Silver Creek with a worn suitcase and a coin pressed so hard into her palm it left a mark. She was going home with something that didn't have a shape yet, but was real and growing, and hers. She picked up her own reins and swung up into the saddle. "Let's go," she said. And they rode north into the mountains toward a ranch that was waiting for them on a ridge under a wide Montana sky. They rode back into the valley on a Wednesday afternoon, and the first thing Clara noticed was that the ridge looked different, not the land itself. The land was exactly as they'd left it, the same grass, the same fence line, the same timber on the north slope. But something in the way she looked at it had changed the way a room looks different when you've been away long enough to stop seeing it with the eyes that built up tolerance for it. She saw it clearly now. What Ethan had built here. 13 years of single-minded patient construction. A life made out of pure stubbornness and honest work. She understood it differently than she had 3 weeks ago. Danny met them at the gate. He'd been staying at the ranch the whole time they were gone, a fact Ethan had arranged quietly and Clara had discovered by finding a blanket folded on the porch chair the morning they left. He met them now with the particular relief of a young man who has been trusted with something important and has been desperate to hand it back safely. "Nothing happened," he said immediately, which was the most telling sentence he could have opened with. "I mean, Marsh came by. Once. Day before yesterday. I told him you were visiting family. He didn't look like he believed me, but he left." Ethan looked at him steadily. "You did right," he said. "He'll know by now," Clara said. "About Helena." She looked at Ethan. "Holloway will have heard." "Yes," Ethan said. "Then we need to be ready for what comes next," she said. What came next arrived faster than either of them expected. It was Thursday morning, barely past 8, when 3 riders came up the ridge road. Clara heard them from inside the house. She recognized the particular sound of horses moving with purpose rather than patience, a faster clip than a social call, a tighter grouping than strangers who happened to be heading the same direction. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. Marsh. 2 men she didn't recognize. And behind them, on a horse that cost more than Danny made in a year, a man she had never seen but recognized immediately from everything Ethan had described. Holloway. She turned from the window. "Ethan?" He was already coming through from the back of the house. He'd heard them too. He looked at her. She looked at him. "He came himself," she said. "Yes," he said. "That means he's scared," she said. "Scared men make mistakes. Let him talk first." Ethan nodded once and went to the door. Holloway dismounted in the yard with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided he was in control of the situation and intended to demonstrate it through his body language before a single word was spoken. He was exactly as Ethan had described, soft-spoken-looking banker dressed. The kind of face that gave away nothing unless you knew what to look for. Clara stood in the doorway behind Ethan and watched Holloway's eyes move over the property with the quick assessing sweep of a man who had looked at a great many pieces of land and calculated their value in seconds. His eyes stopped on her. "Mr. Walker," he said. His voice was exactly as Ethan had described, pleasant, modulated, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it because other means were always available. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Ethan said. "What do you want?" Holloway smiled. It was a good smile, practiced, but not obviously so. "I heard you were in Helena," he said. "I thought it might be worth a conversation before things become unnecessarily complicated." "Things are already complicated," Ethan said. "You made them that way." Holloway's smile didn't move. "I understand there may have been some misunderstandings about the nature of my interest in this valley," he said. "I'd like the opportunity to clear those up directly." "You've been cutting my neighbor's fences," Ethan said. "You've been interfering with water sources. You threatened a 16-year-old boy on a public road." His voice was flat and factual. "Those aren't misunderstandings. Those are actions." Holloway let the smile ease slightly. "Those are serious allegations," he said, "and I'd be very careful about making them publicly without evidence." "I have evidence," Ethan said. A beat of silence. Holloway's eyes moved to Clara again, and this time the pleasantness in his expression had a harder edge underneath it, like a table that looks solid until you press on it from the right angle. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "I believe you and I have a mutual acquaintance." "Gerald Forsythe is not my acquaintance," she said calmly. "He speaks highly of you," Holloway said, in a manner of speaking. "I'm sure he does," she said. "He's been thinking about me for 2 years. It would be strange if he'd run out of things to say." Something flickered in Holloway's expression. It was brief. She almost missed it. She didn't miss it. He had not expected her to be unmoved by Forsythe's name. He had expected the name alone to function as a warning, to remind her of what had happened in Caldwell, to make her feel exposed, to introduce the possibility that what had been done to her once could be done again. She looked at him with the steadiness of a woman who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this moment. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "the Territorial Commissioner's office in Helena issued an injunction on your valley operations yesterday afternoon. The Federal Land Fraud Division has opened an inquiry into the Halloran Western Land and Water Trust, covering 3 territories." She paused. "And Gerald Forsyth received a letter from the Kansas Federal Office this morning. I made sure of that timing specifically." Holloway went very still. Marsh behind him shifted in his saddle. "The federal survey from Caldwell, Kansas has been entered into the record," she continued. "The one your organization spent 2 years trying to keep buried. The one that establishes the water rights your entire Montana operation depends on controlling." She held his gaze. "It turns out that when you spend 2 years chasing a document across 4 states, you should make sure the woman carrying it doesn't know how to use it." The yard was absolutely quiet. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "You brought this here," he said. Something had changed in his voice. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was cold and precise, and she thought genuinely furious in the controlled way of men who are accustomed to outcomes going their way. "She was already here," Ethan said simply. "I just had the sense to recognize what she was worth." It was the most direct thing he had ever said about her. She felt it land in her chest like something coming home. Holloway gathered himself. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Ethan said. "It'll be over when the federal proceeding closes. But you won't be running operations in this valley while that happens." He stepped forward 1 step, just one, but it was the deliberate step of a man who has decided where the line is. "And if Marsh or anyone else who works for you sets foot on my property or my neighbor's properties before this is settled, I will have the federal marshal here before nightfall. Is that clear?" Marsh looked at Holloway. Holloway looked at Ethan, then at Clara. "Abundantly," he said. He turned his horse and rode back down the ridge road. Marsh and the 2 others followed. Clara watched them go until the sound of hooves faded. Then she let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than this morning. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. "Know what you said, about recognizing what I was worth." She turned to look at him. "Thank you for saying that where he could hear it." He looked at her steadily. "I meant it where everyone could hear it," he said, "including you." Danny came around the corner of the house at that moment, which was terrible timing, but he took one look at the 2 of them and turned immediately back around and went the other direction without saying a word. Clara laughed. It surprised her. The laugh itself surprised her, the ease and the genuineness of it, the way it came up without permission. She couldn't remember the last time something had made her laugh like that, without effort, without the background calculation of whether it was safe. Ethan looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that was halfway between startled and undone. "You should do that more often," he said. "Laugh," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "I'm starting to think I might," she said. The conversation he had promised her happened that evening. It happened in the kitchen as he'd said it would at the table, where they had spent more hours than she could count now, building timelines, reading documents, planning, worrying, working through problems in the practical, systematic way that had become their shared language. She made coffee. She sat down. He sat across from her. He didn't open with anything careful. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, which I know you'll do, but I want to say it anyway, because this particular question matters more to me than most." She looked at him. "Ask. When this is fully settled, the federal proceeding, the Caldwell case, all of it, do you want to stay?" He held her gaze. "Not because you've built something here that you don't want to leave. Not because you're tired of moving. Because you want to be here. Because this is where you want to be." She was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer. Because she wanted to give it to him the right way, the honest way with the weight it deserved. I pulled a notice off a post office board because one sentence told me something true about a man I'd never met, she said. And every day since I've been here, that sentence has proven itself over and over. She looked at him directly. I want to stay, Ethan. Not because I have nowhere else to go. Because this is the first place I've been in 2 years where I wanted to stay. He was quiet. There's something else I want to say, she said. Say it. I came here with a suitcase and 2 years of damage and a legal problem that I've now made significantly your problem too, she said. And you didn't flinch. You didn't manage me or protect me or decide what I could handle. You worked alongside me, and you trusted my judgment, and you let me be... She paused, finding the right word, useful. Actually useful. She looked at him. I don't take that lightly. I don't think you understand how rare that is. I think I'm starting to understand what's rare, he said quietly, because I've never had it before either. She held his gaze. The arrangement we agreed to, he said. When you came, the trial period, the practical terms. He set his hands flat on the table. I want to set that aside, all of it, and ask you something different. She waited. Clara Whitmore. He said, will you stay here not on a trial basis, not as an arrangement, as my wife, as my partner, as the person who reads the water survey and catches what I miss and argues with me when I'm wrong and makes coffee at 3:30 in the morning because she knows I need to leave early. She felt it move through her, warm and steady and completely real. You're going to have to argue back sometimes, she said. I'm not always right. I know, he said, and I'm going to want to teach again someday, somewhere in this valley, when there are enough children to warrant it. Ruth Morrison's nieces are 7 and 9, he said. Henry Briggs has 2 grandchildren visiting every summer. Danny can barely read. He paused. I've been thinking about that already. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this for a while, she said. Since about the 2nd week, he said. She felt the laugh try to come back, and this time she let it a small one, warm and private. Yes, she said. I'll stay. As your wife, as your partner. All of it. He looked at her, that open, unguarded expression that appeared so rarely and meant so much precisely because it was so rare. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and this time it wasn't the steadying grip of a man helping her through a crisis. It was different, quieter, more permanent. She turned her hand over and held on. The weeks that followed moved at the pace that honest work moves, not dramatically, but steadily, with the particular satisfaction of things being built right. Marshall Graves sent word in October that the federal injunction had been made permanent, pending the fraud investigation. Holloway's lawyers filed 3 separate challenges. Each one failed on the same evidence: the Caldwell survey, the Colorado timeline, the Montana documentation that Clara had built across 4 days at a kitchen table in the mountains. Marsh disappeared from the valley sometime in late September. Nobody saw him leave. One morning he simply wasn't there, and the men who had worked under him drifted away one by one, like a river finding another channel. Henry Briggs celebrated by opening a bottle of whiskey he said he'd been keeping for 20 years. Ruth Morrison fixed her fences one last time and then contracted Danny to help her repair the well housing that had been interfering with her water flow for months. When they opened it up, they found a deliberate obstruction, a precise engineered block that would have been impossible to explain as natural deterioration. Graves added it to the federal record. The Kansas federal office opened its proceeding against Gerald Forsythe in November. Clara was not required to travel to Caldwell. Her documents entered into the federal record through the Montana proceeding were sufficient to open the case. She received a letter from the federal attorney's office that addressed her as Mrs. Walker and used the word pivotal to describe her contribution. She read that letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the kitchen drawer. Not the false bottom of a suitcase, just an ordinary kitchen drawer, and went out to help Ethan with the afternoon chores. He saw her face when she came out. He didn't ask what the letter said. He just looked at her for a moment and then handed her a fence post and went back to work. That was the best thing he could have done. She knew he knew that. In November, a circuit preacher came through Silver Creek, and Ethan and Clara rode down the mountain on a Tuesday morning and stood in front of him in the church with the yellow curtains in the windows. Henry Briggs stood behind them. Ruth Morrison stood beside Clara. Danny stood beside Ethan wearing a collar that was clearly strangling him and bearing it with stoic determination. The ceremony was short. The words were the old words, simple and serious. When the preacher said, "Do you take this woman?" Ethan looked at Clara and said, "I do," with the same directness he applied to everything. No ornamentation, no performance. Just a fact he was stating in front of witnesses, because it was true. When the preacher said, "Do you take this man?" Clara looked at Ethan and felt 2 years of motion go still inside her, like a compass finally finding north after a long time spinning. "I do," she said. Henry blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief afterward and pretended he hadn't. Ruth Morrison embraced Clara on the church steps, a brief solid embrace, the kind that doesn't need explaining. Danny shook Ethan's hand and then, in a burst of uncharacteristic boldness, tipped his hat to Clara and said, "Mrs. Walker, it's real good you stayed." "Thank you, Danny," she said. "It's real good I stayed too." Bang. Silver Creek changed its relationship to the Walker name that winter in the particular unannounced way that small towns adjust when they've been wrong about something and don't know how to say so directly. People who had whispered about the woman Ethan Walker brought down from the mountain started nodding to her on the street. Mrs. Haverford at the boarding house asked her twice if she'd consider organizing a reading group for the winter months, and the second time she actually meant it. Miss Aldrich stopped her outside the schoolhouse one morning in December and asked with careful dignity whether Mrs. Walker had any interest in teaching a small winter session for the children whose families came into town during the cold months. Clara looked at her. "How many children?" she said. "7 right now," Miss Aldrich said. "Possibly 10. "I'll start next Monday," Clara said. She did. She taught in the Silver Creek schoolhouse on Monday and Wednesday mornings through December and January, and the children who came were exactly what children always were: loud and curious, and startlingly honest and capable of things they didn't know yet that they were capable of. She loved every single session, with the simple, uncomplicated love of a person doing the work they were made for. Ethan came to pick her up on the last Wednesday before Christmas. He came into the schoolhouse quietly, hat in hand, and stood in the back while she finished the lesson. The children looked at him with the transparent curiosity of the young, and he bore it with the patient dignity of a man who had decided that being looked at was a smaller price than he'd once thought. When the lesson was done, and the children filed out, one small girl 7 years old with ink on her fingers and a gap where her front teeth should have been stopped in front of Ethan, and looked up at him with the frank assessment of someone who had not yet learned to pretend. "Are you Mrs. Walker's husband?" she said. "Yes," he said. "She's the best teacher we've had," the girl said. "You should be nice to her." Ethan looked down at her with perfect seriousness. "I'll do my best," he said. The girl seemed satisfied with this. She left. Clara was trying not to smile. "The bar has been set," she said. "I heard," he said. She pulled on her coat. He held it for her, not because she needed help with it, but because it was the kind of gesture that had developed between them naturally without planning the accumulated language of people who have decided to take care of each other. "How is the north fence?" she said. "Needs work in the spring," he said. "Danny thinks we should run the line 20 feet further north." "Is Danny right?" "Probably," he said. "I'm going to pretend to consider it for a week first." She laughed. That came easily now. It had been coming easily for weeks, the laughing, the ease, the ordinary dailiness of a life shared. She noticed it each time, not with surprise anymore, but with a particular attentive gratitude. They walked out of the schoolhouse together into the cold December air, and he offered his arm and she took it, and they walked down the main street of Silver Creek in the plain sight of anyone who happened to be looking. She had arrived in this town 8 months ago and kept to herself, and looked at the ground and tried to be invisible. She walked down the street now with her head up and her hand on her husband's arm and said hello to 3 people by name before they reached the end of the block. It was Henry Briggs who said it best in the blunt, unpolished way that was simply his nature. He came to supper at the Walker Ranch one evening in late January, a thing that had become a semi-regular occurrence. Henry appearing at their table on Thursday evenings with a contribution of some kind, usually something he'd grown or made, and staying long enough to argue about water management and territorial politics, and occasionally, when he felt like it, to say something true. He said it that evening after supper, when Clara had stepped outside for a moment, and it was just the 2 men at the table with the remains of the meal and the comfortable quiet of people who don't need to fill space. "You know what you did," Henry said. Ethan looked at him. "What?" "Built yourself a wall 13 years high," Henry said. "Kept everyone out. Thought that was strength." Ethan said nothing. "Wasn't weakness that knocked it down?" Henry said. He picked up his coffee. "Was just the right person standing on the other side of it long enough." He paused. "That's all it ever takes. The right person and enough patience to wait." Ethan looked at the door where Clara had gone out. "She did most of the waiting," he said. "You both did," Henry said simply. "That's how it works." Clara came back inside a moment later, bringing a breath of cold air and the particular energy she carried, that alert, grounded, forward-facing quality that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her in the livery stable and had never stopped noticing. She looked between them. "Are you two being profound without me?" she said. Henry was being profound. Ethan said, "I was listening." "That's roughly how I'd have described it too," Henry said. She sat back down and poured more coffee, and the 3 of them sat in the warmth of the kitchen and outside the Montana winter, pressed against the windows, and inside there was food and light, and the particular contentment of people who have earned what they have. The federal proceeding against the Halloran Western Land and Water Trust concluded the following spring with findings that were entered into the permanent federal land record. Holloway was removed from his Montana operations pending litigation. 2 of his associates were indicted on fraud charges. The water rights in the valley were formally confirmed under the 1871 Homestead Survey that Clara had carried in a false bottom suitcase across 4 states for 2 years. The Kansas proceeding against Gerald Forsythe took longer, as these things do. But it was moving steadily and in one direction, and the federal attorney who handled it wrote Clara a second letter in March that said simply, "The record is clear, and the outcome is not in doubt." She put that letter in the kitchen drawer with the first one. She did not think about Forsythe much anymore. Not because she had forgotten, but because the part of her life that he had tried to define was no longer the most important part. It was a chapter. A hard one with real damage in it. But not the whole story. The whole story was still being written. She knew that now, in a way she hadn't known anything with certainty in a very long time. In April, when the thaw came, and the spring on the north slope ran clear and full and strong, Ethan took her up there one morning to see it. They stood together and listened to the sound of the water moving over stone, and she thought about how this spring had been mapped by strangers who meant to take it and was still here, still moving, still feeding everything below it the way it always had. "Last summer," she said, "when you put that notice on the post office board, I'd been thinking about it for a year," he said. "Couldn't figure out the right words." "The right words worked," she said. "The right person read them," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the spring, and the morning light was on his face, and he looked like what he was, a man who had built something real out of difficult ground and had learned late, but not too late, that real things are always worth more than easy ones. She took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd come to know best, the open, unhidden one that had no calculation in it. "We need to check the east fence line this afternoon," he said. "I know," she said. "Danny said the big roan got through again." "She always gets through," she said. "She's teaching the others." "I know," he said. "I think I'm starting to respect her for it." Clara laughed there on the north slope with the spring running clear at their feet and the whole valley laid out below. and the Montana sky wide and blue above them. And Ethan Walker held her hand and watched her laugh with the look of a man who has found the thing he didn't know he was looking for. They had both been broken by different hands in different ways in different places. They had both learned to keep going anyway, not because it was easy, but because stopping had never felt like an option. And somewhere between a post office board and a false-bottom suitcase and a kitchen table covered in federal documents and a coffee pot at 3:30 in the morning, they had found each other and built something stronger than either of them could have built alone. Not because they had saved each other, because they had stood beside each other long enough for the saving to happen on its own. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked for the people stubborn enough to stay standing long enough to find out. The spring ran clear. The valley stretched below them green and open and theirs. And Clara Whitmore Walker was finally completely and without reservation home.